Please join me in welcoming Tristan to the stage.
Hello, welcome. I was just reflecting that I haven't really been out in the world probably like you all, and this is a 2-year, I think, anniversary of about when kind of lockdown started to happen, and it's just kind of amazing to be out in the world again. I haven't done this in a very long time. So how many of you here saw The Social Dilemma? Yeah? Okay. Awesome. Today I wanted to talk about not the exact dynamics of the social dilemma, because we all know those issues very well, but kind of where this is all going and what is the wisdom that we need to navigate the first derivative, how fast technology is accelerating past our wisdom. So this talk is about the wisdom that we need to steer technology and our future. So everybody, I often start talks by just re-referencing this quote by E.O. Wilson, that the fundamental problem of humanity is we have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. And I want to double click this time, not on the emotions, which we talk about a lot with magic hacking the human mind, but around the godlike technology. Because technology kept accelerating after the social dilemma. Here's an example. If you give this new technology of deepfakes, some emerging new deepfake AI tech, you give it the following sentence. A girl stood in the blossoming Sunset Valley, pondering the mountains in the distance, peaceful pastel palette, matte painting. And it generates this from scratch. You give it this image, rather, what do you think might have been the text that generated this image? Just think to yourself in your own mind. This coffee has been laced with LSD. You give it Google Soup, and it generates this from scratch. You give it a Mozilla Firefox tarot card and a Google Chrome tarot card, and it generates this from scratch. So this is also new tech that I believe is fresh as of the last 3 months, right? And this didn't exist just months before that. Here's one more. The kind of drawing that the school calls you about and is like, is everything okay at home? Jimmy has been drawing violent pictures and it has everyone worried. And it generates this from scratch. If you look closely, that even has Jimmy scribbled in that one part of the image. So this is where the tech is going. And we find ourselves obviously in a very precarious moment. We have a real situation going on in Ukraine. I'm sure many of us are really feeling that and watching the daily news. And the technology I just showed you, of course, can be applied to this situation. Because I could show you images from the bombings in Kharkiv, except do you think this image is real? Or was it also created by the same technology I just showed you? Which in fact it was. I gave it this text, #breaking, massive explosion reported over Kharkiv, Ukraine. And it generated these images from scratch. So you imagine putting this into a message, and this is like a neutron bomb for trust on the internet, right? So while the social dilemma helped frame the basic issues that we all know well, how technology is affecting mental health, teenagers, addiction, the key thing is to view this system in terms of Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike tech. And the complexity of the world is increasing every day. And our ability to respond to this increasing complexity, this increasing technological speed, is not matching up. So we sometimes draw this graph. If you imagine the complexity of the issues, previously this might have seemed like a list of separate issues, right? What does misinformation have to do with nuclear escalation or synthetic media that I just showed you, or cyber attacks or global financial risk? And we treat these as separate issues. But notice that they're actually connected in the case of what's happening in Ukraine right now, right? The financial situation is the global financial markets are directly triggered by things like cyber attacks, which can actually be leading to things like nuclear escalation. And meanwhile, our ability to make sense of this complexity, right, where we're making more and more consequential choices. How should the world react to Putin and to the situation in Ukraine? There's actually nuclear consequences for how we think about these things. And of course, runaway technology speeds up that curve of the complexity of the issues, because it makes the simple framing of, oh, we have a misinformation problem, let's just build an AI to take a mallet and play a whack-a-mole with that misinformation. It gets more complicated when you add in these brand new deepfake technologies, right? And this is happening across the board. Moreover, as technology goes further, it also decreases our ability to make sense of the world. So those are the two trends I want to talk about. And the key to closing this complexity gap is wisdom. I would sort of define wisdom as the ability to hold in our minds, to make sense of the world in a way that's adequate to the complexity of the consequences of our choices. And you cannot have the power of gods without the wisdom, love, and prudence of gods. So what are some examples? So today I want to argue that the previous wisdom and thinking that we often carry in the tech industry is not holding up to this situation. We have these simple affirms we refer to. Protect freedom of speech. But of course, what happens when you have these new situations that come up? Or let's protect privacy. And of course, we want to protect people's privacy, but then we can make a mistake and we just end up adding pop-ups to the internet and probably reducing the global GDP by 0.1%. Or when it comes to privacy, the fact that tech, again, keeps accelerating. This is a paper from 2018 that you could actually detect the Cambridge Analytica Big 5 personality traits just with 70% accuracy just by looking at the movement of people's mouses on a screen, right? So just looking at people's mouses, you can figure out someone's personality. Or you can actually have technology that now with AI can read people's microexpressions better than a human can. Or you could actually read people's heartbeat. So what does privacy mean when the tech keeps moving? And the tech is continuing to move. So we cannot have the power of gods without the wisdom, love, and prudence of gods. Now, the second part is that technology has been undermining humanity's capacity for wisdom. And I don't just mean the individual, but our collective ability to operate with the wisdom that we need. Because on this graph, let me zoom into the second graph, the decreasing our ability to make sense of complexity. So let's zoom into that. Why is that going down? Okay. So some of you might remember this from another presentation I've given. While we were all looking out from the moment for technology to overwhelm human strengths, that's when it takes our jobs, that's when it's smarter than humans, that's when it has higher IQ than a human does, we missed the much earlier point on the timeline when technology undermines human weaknesses. And this point being crossed was how we got many of the problems that we're now immersed in. So I'll just give you, a handful. And these were our Paleolithic emotions, right? So when our brains had these cognitive limits, we can remember 7 plus or minus 2 things in our brains and cognition. And that being overpassed gave us information overload. And when technology hacked into our dopamine system, that gave us a problem called addiction, addictive use. When technology hacked into our social validation, right, we got influencer culture. It created an entire new lifestyle, entire new careers. When technology hacked into confirmation bias, that gave us a problem called fake news. And when it hacked into our outrage, we got polarization. And when it hacks into the basic heuristics that we use to know what to trust, we get that bots and deepfakes problem. And these are not separate problems, but they're all connected as a system that mutually reinforce each other. And if you take this system and you put it here, you see how this is the thing that's decreasing our capacity to make sense of the world when we need to make sense of the world. Okay. So now let's talk about the wisdom that we are using to solve some of the problems that we're seeing in the world. So when we have a problem with misinformation, we have to say, we have to stop misinformation. Let's do more fact-checking. So what I want to talk about is the way we're defining this problem of stopping misinformation or doing content moderation or doing fact-checking, is that the adequate wisdom or complexity that results in the situation we want to fix? So obviously platforms are doing things like this. They're notifying people, hey, this has been repeatedly shared and it's actually false information. But of course, because technology has been personalizing all of the news feeds for each person for so long, what happens is that actually this just pisses people off because half the people agree that it was misinformation and the other half feel like they're being censored and deplatformed. So is this the right way to think about the misinformation problem? Is the way to solve these problems really about fact-checking? Is fact-checking an adequate philosophical way to think about what the problem is? Well, how many people here know what GPT-3 is? Zoom out. Okay. It's about 1/10 of you. So GPT-3 is, like I showed you, that deepfake technology for images where you can invent new synthetic media, but instead of doing that for images, I can have it create text. So I can say, write me a paper in the voice of Tristan Harris about why Facebook is awesome. And it will use my voice and my mannerisms and my turn phrases of speech to write a paper about why Facebook is great. So if fact-checking was adequate, then I wouldn't be able to do this. I could say to GPT-3, write me a 20-page research paper on why the vaccine is not safe, citing real facts, not fake facts, real facts, real statistics of people who died, and also point out the vested interests of every academic who said it was safe, right? These are all true facts that I can string together in a way that's actually misleading for the world. So what I'm getting at is that the philosophical operating system of are facts true is not adequate to the problem that we're really facing. Now, the second thing is that while we're talking about the problems of misinformation and fake news, there's this deeper thing that's kind of going on that's screwing up the way that we're making sense of the world, which is that we have these perception gaps. How many people here know what a perception gap is? Okay. Perception gaps are the ability for one tribe, like say Democrats, to estimate accurately what are the beliefs of Republicans. And you can just ask a bunch of Democrats, what percentage of Republicans do you believe agree with the phrase that they would consider racism still a problem today in the United States? And you would estimate, so Democrats estimate that less than 50% of Republicans would agree with that phrase. But it actually turns out that 75 to 80% of Republicans agree with that phrase. And perception gaps is measuring the distance between what people think is true about the other tribe and what's actually true about the other tribe. And it turns out the more you use social media, the bigger your perception gaps. That's the correlation is. So the more hours you spend online, the worse you are about estimating what other people believe. So why is that true? Well, in their research, they found out that if you take all the voices on social media, we get hit by a double whammy of misrepresentation of who's saying what. So specifically, you take the extreme voices, you take the moderate voices. Well, it turns out on the first count, extreme voices post more often, right? They're using it more often. They're participating. They're online. They're saying more stuff all the time. And the second is that extreme voices, when they say stuff, they get more reach. They get more virality, right? So we get hit by this massive overrepresentation of these extreme views, and we think that that is in fact what the other side believes. When the moderate voices actually vastly outnumber the extreme ones, but they just don't post very often. And so we start to believe that the extreme voices and stereotypes represent what the other side actually feels and believes. I'll give you a quick example. If you ask Republicans what percentage of Democrats are LGBTQ, they would estimate more than a third of Democrats are LGBTQ. But the actual answer is 6% of Democrats. If you ask Democrats what percentage of Republicans make more than $250,000 a year, and they would estimate more than a third of Republicans make more than $250,000 a year. But the actual answer is only 2%. So we're so confused about each other, and we get into arguments with a phantom, right? We're trapped in this kind of hall of mirrors. We're fighting with these phantoms of the other side. And even if you know this, like I just told you that we live in this world of perception gaps, right? That not people that you've seen online, there's not nearly as many people who believe the extreme things that we think that they do. But notice that's hard for your nervous system to take in, right? Like notice that we still hold the views that we hold about the other side. And this has real consequences. This can escalate to domestic conflict. DARPA has a term for this, which is actually when foreign actors do it, called reality jamming, because we have less and less empathy for each other. And we've been living in different extreme bad faith views of what the other side believes. And I'll give you an example from psychology, right? Even if you know that, how many people here have seen this example in psychology? Raise your hands. No, not that many, I'm surprised, okay. So the square A and the square B, they look like different colors, correct? Yeah? So it turns out these are actually the same color, and I'm gonna show you by putting these lines together. So I don't know if you'll believe it, but A and B are in fact the exact same color. Can you see it? Yeah, okay. If I take these away though, your brain goes right back to seeing it as they're different colors. And notice you don't get to choose that because you're trapped in the 24/7 magic trick of your own mind. Here's the other one. Blue stripes are parallel. How many people here see the blue stripes as parallel? They look like they're diagonal, right? They look like they're off at an imbalance. But let me take the two lines. Now watch in slow motion. It's actually, I did not skew the lines, they're actually straight. But your brain can't see it. And the neuroscientist called Anil Seth wrote a book, and he calls this cognitively impenetrable. There are facts about our minds that even if you know that that's how the magic trick works, you still can't escape the bias that you have. And so if I tell you don't think of an elephant, right, you don't get to choose. And this keeps us trapped in this hall of mirrors where we keep fighting with our fellow countrymen and women, right, as social media drives up polarization. And this is the thing we have to snap, right? We have to break out of this hall of mirrors. So wisdom also means knowing the limits of how we actually work, right? Wisdom is deeply about self-awareness, and it's about the humility to be inquiring, how do we actually work so we can design technology in a more deep ergonomic way? Wisdom also means being able to see in terms of systems and root causes. So what do I mean? There's a great thinker named Donella Meadows, who is actually a systems thinker. She wrote a book called Thinking in Systems. I highly recommend for anybody who hasn't checked it out. And what she wrote about were the 12 leverage points for intervening in a system. So whether you're trying to intervene in the system of climate change or energy or social media, how do you actually change that system from the way it works now to something else? And she gives you these 12 different leverage points. But one of the deepest leverage points that she points to is, what was that? I don't know. The power to transcend paradigms, which is to actually look at the paradigm of thinking that brought us to the places that we're now in with that system. So let me give you an example. What is the paradigm of thinking in the tech industry that got us to where we are? Beyond the business model of maximizing engagement. Everybody knows the problem is so long as their business model is attention, right? We get the problems we do. But beyond that, let's look at the beliefs inside of a person's head who's in the tech industry. So by the way, I'm from Silicon Valley. I'm from San Francisco. I worked in the tech industry. I was a design ethicist at Google. My friends at college. In fact, at South by Southwest in 2012, there's a photo, I should have put it in the slide deck, of the founder of Instagram and I, Mike Krieger, here with the guy who started the field of persuasive technology, BJ Fogg. And so I feel like I know intimately well the belief system of those who are in technology, making technology. So here's one of the main beliefs. We give users what they want, right? We just give users what they want. They want the donut, they want the sugar, they want the cat videos, they want TikTok. Like, we just give it to them. Every tech has goods and bads, right? There's just goods, there's bads. So what's there to do? I mean, there's trade-offs. So we believe that, right? We've always had moral panics about television and radio. We worried about video games making people violent, right? We also want to maximize personalized content. It's probably not phrased exactly like this, but we want to give people the most relevant content. We want to personalize stuff individually to them. Technology is neutral, right? It's not up to us to let people to choose how people should use it. Who are we to choose what's good for people? Who are we to choose what's true or what's bad? We don't want to be the ministry for truth. We should grow at all costs, get that growth hacking engine going. We should obsess over metrics, measure everything, optimize for what's good. And we should obviously capture attention. Just curious, I'm going to look out. How many of you feel like you would agree, if you raise your hand, that these are kind of principles you hear people in the tech industry think in? Okay, so that's actually a fair number of you, yeah. So if you have these beliefs running through a brain, it's no surprise, right, that you're going to get information overload, addictive use, fake news, polarization, because you're giving people what they want. Every tech has goods and bads. Who are we to choose? Keep growing at all costs. Obsess over metrics, right? It's a direct digital fallout from those core beliefs that this gets caused. Okay, so if that was the paradigm that got us here, that was the lack of the complexity and wisdom that was not what we wanted, what will it take to upgrade our paradigm? Well, Donella Meadows, her belief about how you change systems is to keep pointing out the anomalies and failures of the old paradigm, and you keep coming yourself loudly and with assurance from the new one, and you insert people who have the new paradigm into places of public visibility and power. So, what was the old paradigm? Well, I just selected a few instead of going through that long list of beliefs. Here's just a handful. And let's just say, what would a humane technologist do instead of the things on the left? Well, instead of just giving users what they want, we would respect human vulnerabilities. We know what's cognitively impenetrable for people. We know how people's emotions work. We know they can be outraged. We know we can addict them. And we have to respect human vulnerabilities. Then instead of saying every tech has goods and bads, and when we accidentally dump a bunch of polarization into the balance sheets of society, saying that's just a consequence, we have to realize we have to actively minimize harmful externalities before those externalities hit tipping points and you can't reverse people out of the different fractured, online cults that have basically been formed by the online digital cult factory. Instead of maximizing personalization and relevant content that's tailored for each individual person, tailored for what's the most outraging thing, we have to create shared understanding. There are voices online who are really good at saying, I think what that person's trying to say is this, and I think what you're trying to say is that, and I think that you guys would agree on X. There are a handful of those kinds of folks, but right now you are paid in more likes and followers when you shitpost on your fellow countrymen and women, and not when you try to build bridges between people that are disagreeing with each other, right? But there are ways to do that. Instead of saying technology is neutral, and then saying if whatever happens in Myanmar or whatever happens in Ethiopia because social media might drive, when Frances Haugen, the Facebook whistleblower, who's here, by the way, on Monday, I think, you should all go see her talk. When she came out, one of the reasons that she came out was actually these at-risk countries that are developing markets where Facebook doesn't hire content moderators for those languages. And because they just say technology is neutral, right? We're just going to basically show people whatever gets shared the most. And it turned out a lot of the stuff that got shared the most in these at-risk countries was stuff that drives civil wars. And so instead of saying technology is neutral, we need to actively support fairness and justice. So we don't not hire content moderators in those other places. And then instead of saying who are we to choose what's good for people, realize that by not choosing, you are just choosing an unconscious set of values that are currently leading us to the consequences and driving us to the place that we don't want to go. And then lastly, instead of obsessing over metrics, we need to help people thrive. Now, obviously, there's a lot more detail for each of these core principles. And that's actually why we created a course. These are 6 tenets of humane technology. And they actually are part of a new Foundations of Humane Technology course that our team at the Center for Humane Technology has been putting together over the last year and a half. It is actually free and available today. And I really recommend, yeah. Thank you. And I really recommend you all check it out. One of the most powerful things about it, I think, is, well, the goal I'll say first is, we want 100,000 humane technologists who are trained in, I would not say the wisdom that we need, but we're going from kind of toddler level adolescence and how we're thinking about technology to at least some basic adulthood maturity. And we would like to have 100,000 humane technologists who are trained in that new paradigm. And one of the things about it is actually about building a community of people who are all taking the course together, because it's actually hard to think about these things when you feel like you're the only one asking these questions. And a lot of people feel that way. When I was inside of Google as a design ethicist, I struggled for 4 years trying to get people to pay attention. And I couldn't get the interest, right? I mean, nothing was changing. And I think a lot of people in the tech industry feel that way. And so a lot of the benefit of this is actually putting people together so they can meet other people who share these values. And now when you imagine you actually have these kinds of values and they're running inside the mind of a humane technologist. Instead of the consequences that we're now seeing, what kind of consequences could we see? Could we have, instead of influencer culture, we have a wisdom culture? We could reward nuanced thinking. We could be sensitive to people's flow and balance. We could have technology that's about helping us learn and grow, get the background learning that we need to help understand some of these complex issues. And I really want to focus for just 1 minute on how important creating shared understanding really is. Because we are heading into a period of time of increasing global catastrophes and crises, right? We're going to see more refugees in the next 10 years, 20 years. We're going to see more climate refugees. We're going to see more climate events. We're going to see more destabilization inside of the nation-state system. We've got crypto creating more consequences. It has never been more important for those who are working on technology to help create more shared understanding that matches the complexity of the issues that we're facing. And I really wanted to put a plug out for the Consilience project, which has a great course on sense-making. What are all the ways that sense-making is currently breaking right now? And this is a video, 5 videos that are really going in detail about the kind of sense-making that we need. It's not about fake news, it's about how can we make quality sense. And that's from the Consilience project. And they have papers like this on how to mislead with facts, that you can have an entirely true paper on why the vaccine isn't safe that's cherry-picking data, decontextualizing facts, et cetera. We need the philosophical operating system to deal with the new kinds of AIs that can be able to generate things that are totally true with facts, but are not true in the sense of what they're implicating for people's minds. So just to recap, wisdom, means knowing our limits. It means knowing the limits of the human mind and how we really work. It means seeing in systems and root causes. And it means understanding the interconnected complexity of the problems. I go back to this Danella Meadows quote because I think it's just so powerful. My goal is to have you and everyone you know, be moving into these positions of power with this different paradigm, because that's how we can change the system. Now, I know this might sound really impossible. It does to me often. I want to make sure I'm expressing that. It's hard to look at, you've got $1 trillion market cap, multiple $1 trillion market cap companies that their business model is to keep doing what they're doing, right? How many of you, when you see the social dilemma and you feel like, okay, there's this massive thing, but how is that ever going to change? Like, does, feel that way? I'll tell you why I have hope, or what gives me some hope. Because I have seen this system change so much faster in the last few years than I've ever seen that change happen. And just to give you a sense of that, back in February 2013 is when I first created this slide deck inside of Google that was basically about the attention economy and how technology was creating this arms race to manipulate these deeper human emotions and instincts inside of us. And I saw where this was going to go. And I was trying to get people to pay attention. This was the presentation, if you remember, in the social dilemma that is highlighted. That was February 2013. It took 4 years until then Anderson Cooper covered it on 60 Minutes and talked about the attention economy and the memes of the attention economy and time well spent. They made it out there. People like Jaron Lanier were talking about these issues. People like Eli Pariser were talking about filter bubbles. We've had people like Sophia Noble come out with her book Algorithms of Oppression, and really highlighting the complexity of how these issues are actually hitting marginalized groups. We had Renee DiResta, who's also in the film, who studied Russian propaganda, come out. And we saw more whistleblowers come out. This is Guillaume Chaslow, who's also in Social Dilemma, who's the YouTube recommendations engineer, who said, we have a really big problem with how YouTube's recommending people down these rabbit holes. We covered him on our podcast. We had Zeynep Tufekci come out. We've had Chris Hughes, the co-founder of Facebook. I would have never guessed that the co-founder of Facebook, the third one, less known, would write an article in the New York Times saying it's time to break up Facebook. If you asked me so many years ago, I would have never thought that memes that we tried to help get out there, like the time well spent debate, say the time well spent debate is over, the time well spent won. Why? Because Apple actually launched these screen time features. And we had companies adopting the time well spent frameworks. We've seen more whistleblowers like Sophie Zhang, from Facebook actually talk about the problems. Then we had, of course, Timnit Gebru from Google. And then we've had Frances Haugen, who again is speaking on Monday. And really just the bombshell of releasing all this information that told us what was really going on inside the company. And this has had a major impact. In the same way that Big Tobacco had this moment where we had the CEOs testify before Congress, we've now had that moment. I would have never predicted that we would have had that moment with technology back in 2013. Much like with Big Tobacco, where what really changed it, where you had these state attorney generals who actually sued the tobacco companies for the harm that they created. We're now seeing attorney generals do this with Instagram and the impact on mental health. They just did it recently with a new TikTok probe. This was, I think, just last week. And the pace of these things is going faster and faster. If you had a Geiger counter, you would hear a click, a click, a click, a click, and then it just keeps faster and faster. And so, I would have never been able to guess that, just 6 months ago, since Frances came out, Frances Haugen, the whistleblower, Facebook's stock price is down 50%, nearly 50% from where it was back then. I would have never guessed that these kinds of things would have been possible years ago when we were trying to get people to pay attention about these things. And we're even seeing one of the most important things, which is that technologists are actually waking up and saying, I don't want to participate in the toxic part of the industry. I want to help build the better part. And I would have never been able to guess years ago that these issues would be highlighted in a presidential State of the Union address. In this case, Frances Haugen was highlighted by President Biden just like a week ago. And I would have never been able to guess that a film that tried to highlight these issues, when we were working on the social dilemma, we did not think that this was going to be the big film that totally transformed the world. It has been seen by more than 100 million people in 190 countries and 30 languages. And so, we would have never been able to guess that all of these people would come together, all these organizations would get spawned, and all these people would be working on different aspects of this problem, and many of you are working on these problems. And so our ability to meet the world's challenges depends on our ability to make sense of the world adequately and then to work together, to be coordinating together. The world's biggest problems are coordination problems. Climate change is a coordination problem. Inequality is a coordination problem. They're about people from different sides coming together and agreeing on what we need to do. And we can't have business models that are dependent on dividing us and making us hate each other. And so this is what I would like to impart to all of you, is we need everyone working on helping us close that complexity gap. So, going back to the beginning, if this is the fundamental problem statement of humanity, of E.O. Wilson, that we have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike tech, then one possible answer is we need to embrace our Paleolithic emotions, upgrade our medieval institutions, and then have the wisdom to wield that godlike technology. So, thank you, and we'll take some questions. Oops. All right. I don't know how the questions work. How does this work? Is there microphones that are out there, or no? Oh, here we go. I see. Okay. Are there companies that are 100% humane tech oriented? Can you mention some? Are you guys seeing this? You guys aren't seeing the questions that I'm seeing. I think the guys in the back, you're welcome to switch it away from the slides and switch to the questions if you want. Let's see. Are there companies that are 100% humane tech oriented, and can you mention some? I don't know if I would say it's a really hard thing. I think there's a lot of companies that want to move in this direction. Our head of mobilization, David J., is in touch with many of them. We're seeing a lot of people who are in the course who are trying to build new humane tech companies. We're seeing actually investors who are saying we don't want to fund the other paradigm. And one of the things, by the way, is as those attorney generals and the litigation comes up that basically says there's a cost on these business models that monetize human attention, that treat us as the product and not the customer, that changes the incentives for future investors, right? Because a venture capitalist doesn't want to fund another social media company that they're going to say is going to be a problem in the future. They want to fund something that's different. So I'm seeing a lot of movement between the pressure from Congress, the attorney generals that are putting essentially a tax on the future viability and financial success of some of the social media companies, and then a lot of people who are interested in humane technology. But I would say this is a very early field. And it does go against certain incentives, right? It's very hard when if you raise venture capital and the expectation is you have to scale up to having millions and millions of users and get acquired by one of the big companies, that you can be sort of 100% mission aligned. But there's great organizations out there like New Public. How many people here know Eli Pariser's New Public organization? Not that many. So that's another great organization to check out. They're trying to aggregate all what they call public interest technologists. And I would really recommend people check out the work that they're doing. Okay, another question. Do you think the government will harm or boost the approach of humane technology? From Tobias Lang. I want to say that all the reasons people are skeptical of the government getting this right are totally valid, right? In fact, in our work, I remember when we visited Senator Mark Warner's office right before there was the first tech hearings back in 2017. And we've seen this go from no one talking about it in the government to there being now, there's been so many different tech hearings. And of course, if you remember, what do you all remember when you think about Mark Zuckerberg testifying before Congress? You remember one critical cultural moment. What was that moment? It was, how do you make money? And then what did Zuckerberg say? Senator, we sell ads, right? Everyone remembers that moment. Okay, so if I were Zuckerberg, I would have paid to have that moment happen because it just did all of the cultural work to make people not want the government to do anything because everyone thinks that then all of the senators are like that and don't know how Facebook makes money and they won't possibly get it right. What makes me optimistic is that people like Frances Haugen and many others, whistleblowers, are coming forward and wanting to directly advise the government. One clear thing, by the way, that would really help that Frances advocates for, and we did a great interview with her on our podcast, which I highly recommend, which is just advocating for transparency. If Facebook was forced, and the other companies, by the way, if they were all forced to publish essentially the most shared viral links on their platform in every market, in every language. That would create the transparency so that investigative journalists and newspapers could basically show where it's really, really toxic. And there are places in the world where we think it's bad here in the US, but we actually have the most content moderators and the most fact checkers and the most attention and the most resources that are paid to it here in this country. And a lot of the countries that get screwed over, they're not profitable countries for Facebook. So they don't have any attention. And that's why this transparency would actually make a really big difference for many of these at-risk countries. That actually, Frances, when she worked at Facebook, she worked on the civic integrity team, which was the team that worked on many of these at-risk countries. And that's actually why she came forward. So that's my hope for the government, is that there is some work immediately done on transparency, and that there's a lot more momentum, I think, from people like Frances and others that are coming forward to help advise them. Okay, next question. Do you think Web3 and decentralization can be a solution for big tech? I'm going to be really honest that I would consider myself not an expert for Web3 and decentralization. I would say that I think decentralization, we obviously have a problem when we have centralized companies who we have no democratic oversight over, right? Facebook can just change its algorithms tomorrow to be more profitable and cause more civil wars, and there would be no oversight about how they're changing it. That's one of the core problems. And obviously decentralizing that power into places where there is many more DAOs and things like that, where there's democratic governance, would be a good thing. But my concern is that if we're still running the philosophical operating system of giving people personalized news and content, then you could just have 100 decentralized blockchain-based things that are still driving people into these filter bubbles and getting angry at each other because we're still rewarding that engagement. So that's my concern about, again, I think the lesson for this talk is that for the Web3 and decentralized community, how do we have the wisdom of gods that matches the power of gods that you all have in your hands if you're building in Web3? Who is going to determine what is fair, just, and neutral? From Anonymous. That is a good question, and I don't think I have a good, easy answer to that. I'm going to maybe pass on that one. These are all really, I just want to say, these are all really deep questions, right? I can say more on that. So on fair, just, and neutral, I heard the sigh in the audience. I'm going to make sure I'm not just ignoring people. I also have quite a lot more time left than I thought. I thought the talk was going to take quite a lot more time, so, but I'm happy to keep answering questions. So who's going to determine what is fair, just, and neutral? Well, one of the main ways, again, that the world is getting kind of screwed over, much like climate change affects the poorest people in the worst ways, right? They get the worst of it, and the West is kind of creating the problem, but the climate change affects the poorest of them all. I feel like that's what social media and these big tech companies do as well, right? Because the VP of Integrity at Facebook, Guy Rosen, he actually said, the cost of adding the next billion users online onto Facebook, if you think about it, they're not the ones who speak English already. They're not the ones who are part of markets where Facebook has already invested resources. So they don't have an incentive to build new language models for hate speech or toxic content or things like that in these brand new next billion people that are coming online, because they're from the markets that make them the least amount of money, right? And so because of that, the systems can't be fair, just, and neutral, because it's sort of like we put seatbelts only in the cars where the regulators are, the governments are that can regulate the car companies, which are in the US, and we let the rest of the world kind of go without seatbelts. That's kind of the first core thing, is the economic incentives don't reward that. And so at the very least, we have to, instead of marginalizing all these groups where they get the worst experiences and it actually drives up major conflict and major issues in the country, we need to have a more fair way of dealing with that. Okay, next question is, looking from the inside, do you believe tech companies have coded or deciphered the cognitive impenetrable? From Paula Rizzo. Let's see. Have they coded or deciphered the cognitive impenetrable? I'm not sure if I know exactly what that means. I think that just to be clear, I don't think that people at tech companies actively grow a mustache and twist the end of it to say, how can I break the cognitive impenetrable parts of the human mind and keep people addicted? I don't think that there's much intentionality. I do think that there's willful ignorance about really saying, hey, we're just giving people what they want when we actually were actively doing something that was manipulative. I'll give you one clear example. Have you ever tried to cancel or delete your Facebook account? No. If you do, it'll say, so if you go to your page and you say, I want to delete my account, and then Facebook will put a little extra question in front of you. They'll say, are you sure you want to delete your account? Because it'll show you 5 faces of 5 friends. And it'll say, these people will miss you. Do you think that Facebook tapped those 5 friends on the shoulder and asked them, hey, are you going to miss Tristan if he leaves? And do you think that they chose them randomly, or do you think that they picked those 5 friends because those were the ones that you always go back to? So they're maximizing that loss aversion of fear, I'm going to lose access to hearing what those friends are going to say. Now, some people would say that's just good marketing, right? That's just good growth hacking. Like, we're about to burn out a user, and they're going to stop using it. And that's like a really clever strategy. And in fact, that is from the kind of playbook of persuasive technology. In fact, I went to, how many people here know the book Hooked by Nir Eyal? Okay, good amount of you. I would expect that at South by Southwest. The book is about how to hook users. And it actually, I went to Nir Eyal's Hooked conference in 2015, and there was a guy from Pinterest talking. And he actually said, like, now if a user gets burnt out or they're using it too much, don't worry. If they stop using it, there's all these 10 reactivation patterns. Here's these 10 techniques you can use to get people to come back. And I think that's the thing that I think companies do know. And we have to admit that we know it. And we have to ask, what's a more humane way to relate to those customers? OK. What is the role of regulators on the way towards humane tech? And are the European Digital Services Act / Digital Markets Act a step in the right direction? From Jacob von Linden. To be honest, I am not usually on top of the latest writing of the various bills. And so what I can say is, in the past, Europe has been really concerned with extreme content. Like, how do we make sure that we make platforms either liable for the very extreme toxic content and hate speech, and we want them to take down that hate speech. Now, that regulatory approach allows the ongoing, that's like the, on a scale from white to gray to black, the hate speech stuff that's extremely toxic, that you can imagine skimming off the toxic foam from a fundamentally toxic drink, but the gray spectrum stuff, in which basically people are saying negative things about their fellow countrymen and women, and you get paid more in more likes and more followers, the more creative you are at shitposting on someone else. The EU regulatory framework doesn't deal with that, the kind of gray area polarization. So I would say that's what my concern is that the regulatory approach, again, doesn't match the complexity of what the issue really is, which is not just fake information or toxic information, but the incentives to drive up polarization. OK, are you working on creating more media about the impact of technology on children? I'm not working on that. Frances Haugen actually is, I think, working more closely on the impact on children, and I would recommend people check out, if you're interested in that topic, there's a great documentary, another documentary called Childhood 2.0, which really goes into, I think, a really great detail about how this is affecting kids in a deeper way, because the social dilemma only barely scratched the surface. What can non-engineer professionals in the tech industry do to support humane tech? Is this only changed from product development action? Okay. What can non-engineer professionals in the tech industry do? I mean, I think that everybody who's in a tech company who has a role, you could be on a policy team. I think Katie Harbath from Facebook is here, and she's now kind of gone public, and she was on the policy team for Facebook. Designers who are in the company. I think in many different roles, people can speak up in meetings and ask, I think, more challenging questions. David on our team, our head of mobilization, has resources available for people who are looking to find more ways for more whistleblowers to speak up in companies. And I think a lot of it comes from community. It comes from a sense of safety that if you raise these questions, you won't get fired. And I think that there are ways of doing that. I recommend the Humane Technology course for finding more people who I think can feel supported in that process. That was one of the most surprising things in the course was that how many people felt like they wanted to raise these questions, but they didn't know how. And when you're alone in that, I think it's really hard. And when you have other people you can turn to, I think it really makes a difference. Okay. Social data and algorithms work really well for advertising. What advice do you have for brands and those who work in advertising to do less bad and more good? So one of the things to say about this is that if you agreed with everything I just said in that talk, and you're an advertiser, you don't have another place to go to reach those customers, right? This is why the system is so sticky, because the companies have a monopoly on reach. So if you're doing marketing, if you're doing advertising, you have a custom audience list for Facebook lookalike models or whatever. How are you going to reach people without these tools? Because they have a monopoly on reach. And if you were trying to get the word out about your company, are you going to use some no-name platform that has 100 users on it, or are you going to go use the platform where everybody is? And so one of the core problems, this is where the Antitrust Monopoly conversation I think comes in, is that so long as this is the only place to go, this is the only game in town, there really isn't going to be another way to get out of it. And so I would say, we were part of this Stop Hate for Profit campaign that happened in July 2020. Does anybody remember the Stop Hate for Profit campaign? It was great. There was about 1,000 advertisers on Facebook who said, we're going to get together and we want to put pressure on the company to do something different. Not just Facebook, I think it was a couple other companies like YouTube, things like that. But one of the problems that makes these companies so invulnerable to market pressure is that if you're Facebook, how many advertisers do you think Facebook has? If you had to guess, I'm sorry, I'm asking a question, think it in your own mind. A lot of people might think there's like an 80-20 rule, right? Where most of their revenue comes from a small number of advertisers. That's like most businesses, right? You have 1 million customers, but then there's like 100 that you really get all your revenue from. That's how most businesses work. One of the powers of Amazon or a Facebook or a Twitter or a Google is that you don't have an 80-20 rule. As the book The Long Tail, the guy who used to run Wired wrote this book called The Long Tail, you make most of your money from these millions of small advertisers, right? And so one of the core problems is that you can't aggregate enough of that pressure from the long tail to actually get the companies to do something different. Because instead of saying, let's convince the top 100 Nikes and so-and-sos, you have to convince that, I think there's more than 6 million advertisers that are rotating through Facebook every single day. That was a number from 2 years ago. So imagine how many you would need to get to become part of a coalition to say, hey, Facebook, we want you to change your practices. Now, if someone wants to organize that and get 6 million advertisers, then we should talk. But I think that's kind of the issue for you as a person who's advertising, is you don't have another place to go. Okay. Should humane technology be included in essential education? And do you have a recommendation for how we can integrate it into education systems? I think that the course is fantastic for people who are in college level, I would say, dealing with these questions, maybe even senior high school level. And I would think that humane technology should be included as a essential education. And one of the things that was most impressive to me is how much The Social Dilemma as a film became just core curriculum. Like, I think during the pandemic, every high school, every middle school that I knew of or that I heard about basically watched it. And I still hear from people who are showing it every year, and this is the second year they showed it. And one of the most inspiring things I heard actually from Audrey Cronin, who we just interviewed on our podcast, and I recommend, again, people check out the podcast. What she said was, when she showed The Social Dilemma to people a year ago, her students are college age, they got very defensive, and they didn't agree with the message. Because it's kind of an indicting message, right? You're basically saying, oh, like, there's something wrong with me if I'm using technology in this way. And so they were kind of negative on the film. And that was in 2021. When she showed it this year, only a couple weeks ago, she said her entire class was totally different. They were all on board. I think it's post January 6th, post a lot of things that are happening, post Frances Haugen, the Facebook whistleblower, coming out. I'm really proud of the way that I think the film has continued to hold up, and that more things have come out only to further instantiate and substantiate the kind of core message. So that's just a little nice trivia on the film. All right. Sorry, I didn't mean to answer so. I hope this is interesting to you all. I'm just kind of hanging out. I thought the talk was really going to last a lot longer, but time goes differently. Following your code of ethics, which social media platforms make sense to participate in, and how? This is such a good question. We've struggled with it for our work because obviously we're the guys who are saying that it's a bad thing and there's some real problems with it, and so we want to be very conscious about our participation. I think that actually there's a Medium article that we wrote a couple years ago about this, about our values and how we show up and when we post with Center for Humane Technology on social media. I might recommend people check that out. All of us have problems with fossil fuels driving climate change, but we all got on a plane to come here, right? All of us have problems with social media driving democracies into chaos, but we also all use social media. At the very least, can we show up with the consciousness of what it's doing? If everybody who used social media understood how it worked and knew the things that we're talking about in this room, and kind of knew as much about how it's warping and deranging people's beliefs, I think we could live in a world where people do use it more, because we'd at least have some kind of internal shield or immunity as a culture to how it's impacting people. And so that's why you can't have the power of gods without the wisdom of gods. When you are using social media, you are using a godlike impact machine, right? You are impacting people at scale. In the same way that we've learned with COVID that we could be shedding, COVID particles in people. When we use social media, we're shedding biases into the epistemic comments, how other people are perceiving reality. So I think we just all need to be very conscious. When you're participating in an angry way and you're building on top of a boogeyman that someone else built to make people angry or fearful or whatever, I think that's a place where we can stop and say, do I really want to escalate and participate in that way? All right, curious, has this Humane Tech course been sent to boards, Zuck, staffers from Facebook, Twitter, Snap? Could they pass and apply it better? Humane Tech is the way. Awesome, Sarah May. The Humane Tech course has been in beta for a few months while we've been testing it. We have had small groups of employees from, I don't remember the exact companies. Facebook, I think, was one of them. I think there's been small groups from Apple. There's been a bunch of small groups at companies. And it's actually really nice when there is a little cohort, because then if they're taking it together, you're building a shared language so you can refer to it later when you're in your work. I don't think that it's been sent to the board of Facebook, and I don't think Zuck has seen it. But I agree that it would be really nice if those things happened. How do you recommend we support this effort to push it through faster? Yeah, it's such a good question. It's really hard, right? It's like climate change. It's like the scale. It's like, how do we recommend we get climate change reform, carbon emissions drawdown reform to happen faster than it is? It's really tricky. I think that more people who haven't seen The Social Dilemma watching it, when we did the film, we actually had this campaign idea. If you remember in the film, the head of growth at Facebook said, how did we get someone hooked to Facebook? It was, what's his name again, the Indian guy? I forgot his name. Chamath Palihapitiya. He was the head of growth at Facebook, and he said, the way we got someone hooked to Facebook is if we got you to 7 friends in 10 days, then we know we had you for life. All we had to do was get you to 7 friends in 10 days, and then boom, we had you as addicted forever, basically. And we had this campaign idea for the film, which is that if everybody who saw the film got 7 people in 10 days who had not seen the film to see it, that's like reverse virality. You're making the immunity go viral as fast as the viral machine went viral. And you're matching. If that was the thing that caused people to get addicted, let's at least try to spread the wisdom with the same level of virality that it got people hooked. We didn't end up doing that, but I think things like that, I think we need to think about how do we make these positive answers go viral. One of the costs for us for not participating on social media very often as an organization, and for me personally, is that we are not out there that much. Like, we're not dominating the public discourse because that's not how we're choosing to engage. And I think just like the moderate voices are the silent majority, you know, if you have a view about reform, you're going to be a more quiet, reserved person. So I think we have to figure out how to match the virality of the immunity with the virality of the addiction. Do you think Wall Street / how we value companies needs to be changed? Billions of dollars can be wiped away depending on daily active users and monthly active users. How do we change that? Well, this is actually really interesting because if you had asked me, could you ever half the stock price of Facebook? I would have never believed that was possible. Right there, it was a $1 trillion market cap company, and it has just all these asymmetric resources to keep influencing people. One thing people don't know, if you're trying to influence culture to have a positive view of Facebook, to have a negative view of Facebook, they had a project called Project Amplify, which was basically to make people have positive views on Facebook. So if you liked horses, they would distribute, say, positive news stories about Facebook helping people who lost their horse get found because their neighbor found it on a posted group or something like that. And they can micro-target positive stories about their thing to everybody who uses it. And I say that because it speaks to the asymmetric power that they have to control the accountability, like legs of the stool, right? So if you're making a system accountable that's not accountable, you can go to culture, meaning the court of public opinion. You can go to the state, to regulation and legislation. Or you can go to, what am I forgetting? State, culture, and markets. Markets, you could actually say, I'm going to outcompete it. I'm going to build something that's an alternative. So got that? So we can go to the court of public opinion, we can go to the state, or we can go to markets. Well, you can't compete with these things in the marketplace because they have these sort of Metcalfe monopolies on people's data. And the only way you can usually compete with it is by going lower in the race to the bottom of the brainstem. So TikTok is competing with it all successfully. TikTok, I think, just passed YouTube in terms of minutes spent online, by the way. And everything we've said about the other companies you could say about TikTok. And the way it does that is by being even more addictive, more predictive, and tapping even more into human vulnerabilities and vices, right? So you can compete that way. But you can't compete by making some better thing, not when they have the amount of control they have. So the market one, that's kind of the problem with that. On the culture one, I just said that problem. I think we're actually doing a good job of fighting back there and pushing back. And when it comes to the market, when it comes to the state, I think the problem is that Facebook has been, and these companies have been polarizing the debate. I'll tell you one quick last story. I've got a minute and a half left, and I'll just tell you this story. In October, I was in New York at a hotel, and I was watching Frances Haugen do her live congressional testimony. And I saw senators in the US from the left, the Democrats, and from the right, the Republicans, agree for the first time that I've ever seen them agree. Like, they actually said, I'm worried about this. I'm worried about how this is affecting my children. I'm worried about this for how it affects national security. And they said out loud, no matter what our differences are, they don't matter, because we need to act to deal with these companies. And I literally got emotional hearing that, because for working on this for 8 years, we never heard that for this whole time. And Frances Haugen had a meeting scheduled the next day with one of the Republican senators, who I won't name. And she was supposed to meet with him, but then a story went viral about her saying that she was a CIA operative, and that her testimony, she was a PSYOP. She was actually some kind of Democratic CIA operative, and the government was using her as a plant to justify censoring free speech. And people like Glenn Greenwald and others picked this up, and it became very popular on right-wing media. And it turned out that story had been planted, actually, by Facebook. And her meeting the next day with this congressman in Washington, he actually canceled the meeting with her. And he canceled the meeting because he said, I can't meet with you because my base would be upset because everyone thinks that you're a Democratic operative. So that speaks to the very nature of the problem, which is that if an oil company has an oil spill doesn't directly decrease the capacity of government to regulate oil spills, But when social media companies dump accidental polarization and misinformation into the social fabric, it directly decreases the coherence of government to actually regulate something effectively. So that's an example, I think, of the kind of issue that we face. So it looks like I'm out of time, but I just want to thank you all for coming. It really means a lot to me that you care so much.